Good afternoon, ASHRAE Code of Ethics. In this and all other ASHRAE meetings, we will act with honesty, fairness, courtesy, competence, inclusiveness, and respect for others, which exemplify our core values of excellence, commitment, integrity, collaboration, volunteerism, and diversity. And we shall avoid all real or perceived conflicts of interest. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar session on the impact of volcanic eruptions on health and infrastructure. We would like to kick off with a couple welcome statements from our key personnel. First, passing on to President George Nicholson. George, I press to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. George Nicholson, President of ASHRAE Caricom. Very pleased to have you here today as we discuss the topic that is affecting us in the Caribbean region, Barbados and St. Vincent in particular. We're very pleased to have some experts with us today, both from our region and from overseas. I'd like to pass on now to Professor Badahar. Say his welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. The University of the West Indies Faculty of Engineering is proud to be associated with ASHRAE Caricom in this timely and appropriate webinar in light of the ASHRAE volcanic eruptions. The topics being discussed today is of direct and immediate significance to St. Vincent and the neighboring Caribbean islands. Thank you for participating.
I believe George was muted, but my name is Robin Bryant. I'm the Director and Regional Chair for ASHRAE for Region 12. Good afternoon. And on behalf of the ASHRAE Caricom Chapter, Region 12, and the more than 52,000 ASHRAE members across the world, I would like to extend our heartfelt thoughts and prayers to all those in St. Vincent and Barbados who are dealing with the devastating effects of the ASHRAE volcanic eruption. ASHRAE's vision is a healthy and sustainable built environment for all. We provide the technical data and education to students, design professionals, owners, and government officials who share that same vision. Today's presentation is in response to an overwhelming number of requests for ASHRAE's guidance. We hope you find it informative, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Robin. My apologies. Yes, I was muted. So we'd like to first introduce our panelists. Dr. Erouscilla Joseph. She's the Director and Research Fellow at the UWI Seismic Research Center in Trinidad. Dr. Joseph is a Caribbean volcanologist who is involved in the study of emissions, gas and waters associated with active volcanic systems. She's been associated with the UWI Seismic Research Center, SRC, for the past 17 years, first as a graduate student and as a member of staff, and is presently the director of the center. Dr. Joseph also provides scientific and administrative support in monitoring efforts at the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, including due to sciences, ground deformation monitoring, dome volume monitoring, and gas monitoring. At the SRC, she is responsible for the geothermal monitoring program, which involves the collection and analysis of volcanic gases and geothermal waters in the islands of the Lesser Antilles, and its application to monitoring changes in volcanic activity. Her other research interests include study of the hazards and impact of persistently degassing volcanoes, and the use of low-cost technology for the monitoring of volcanic emissions, and the behavior of the magmatic component in the volcanic gases. Dr. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I will share my screen when possible. So as most people would know, the ASHRAE volcano began to show an effusive eruption on the 27th of December. This continued up until the end of March. This is what the crater of the volcano looks like prior to the eruption, and the new dome began growing in the west-southwest sector. The picture to the top is a look at what it looked like on the 3rd of March. Then, in response to this effusive eruption, the SRC's response was to strengthen our monitoring network and to work closely with the National Disaster Coordinator on island to increase our monitoring efforts there, to conduct essential and additional field work, to provide regular advisories and briefings to a large number of decision makers, and to respond to media inquiries. We also participated in public and virtual town hall meetings. Then this is what the monitoring system looked like. The network consisted of 8 seismic stations, 6 CGPS stations. We conducted EDM measurements on a weekly basis. We used INSA satellite data to look at ground deformation processing. We conducted multicast measurements from the summit and looked at changes in the dome volume and growth rate. On the 9th of April, the eruption moved from effusive, which is the slow extrusion of magma at the surface, to an explosive eruption with generation of ash clouds over 8 kilometers high, with ashfall in Richmond, Belmont, and the Belmont Observatory. Ash was also seen to move towards Barbados. The ongoing seismicity at the time included VT swarms and small long period earthquakes. So this is a picture of seismicity as of today. So at the beginning, we saw repetitive explosions, and then a gradual changing of this pattern to more increased intervals between explosive events. The predominant seismic activity or signal being seen right now is low long period earthquakes. This is associated with the movement of gas and magma in the plumbing system of the volcano, as compared to the VT earthquakes, which was seen at the beginning when magma adept was trying to break up the rock below the volcano to find a pathway up. Changes in ground deformation. This is as of yesterday. The diagram on the left shows the measurements using our continuous GPS network on island, and we're seeing a signal that is correlated to the deflation of the volcano, which is as a result of the extrusion the explosions taking place. And then the diagram on the right is based on INSA processing, and we are seeing no significant shallow deformation, which is consistent with what is happening with respect to the explosions being seen. With respect to gas measurements, so we've been obtaining SO2 flux from the plume via satellite imagery, but a few days ago we were able to actually use a DOAS and conduct field measurements and successfully measure the plume by ground-based measurements. We see a consistent decrease in the mass of SO2 measured after the 10th of April. This is a snapshot of some of the education and outreach tools that we've used to share information to a wide variety of stakeholders. With respect to changes in the volcano, physical changes, we continue to work with NASA and a number of other, and the USGS to generate products associated with imaging the volcano, not just for ground deformation, but also to look at the impacts. And this is an example of what was seen between the 13th of April and the 14th, where we can see evidence of the pyroclastic flows both on the south side and on the eastern side of the volcano, as well as lahars and mud flows, as well as changes in the dome and the crater of the volcano itself. This is a more up-close picture where you can see on the 15th of April that we're getting some images of the new crater with possible multiple vents. We're seeing tephra deposits, as well as the 1812 crater still exists, and we're seeing an increase in the size of the crater floor based on slumping seen of the northern rim of the crater. And there's extensive tephra deposits, particularly to the northeast, that's blanketing the crater floor. With respect to some of the impacts, again, through satellite imagery, we're seeing large-scale impacts. These are images both on the west side as well as the east side, where pyroclastic flows as well as heavy ashfall has impacted several villages. On the eastern side, we see impacts from Fancy all the way down to Georgetown, and on the west side, we see impacts in Chateau Belair, Richmond Vale, and Monronde. You can get a better idea of the extent of the ashfall in this diagram, where you see the heaviest impacts we're seeing in the red area, the red zone. This is the zone directly surrounding the volcano, and heavy to moderate impact from the ashfall extending not only into the orange zone, but into the yellow zone, and of course, island-wide impacts, moderate to light. So just some pictures to support the other types of hazards or impacts from the hazards from the volcano. We are, of course, we're seeing pyroclastic density currents reaching coastlines at both Laracay and Walibu, as well as lahars or mud flows being seen, such as in Sandy Bay from this image. Again, just to familiarize everybody, these are the map on the left shows the hazard map for St. Vincent, and the diagram, the table on the right, shows what red means in terms of alert levels and what response is taken by the scientists as well as the civil authorities. In terms of the prognosis as of today, we're seeing the seismic tremor at a rate that was prior to the eruption that took place yesterday evening, and we're not seeing any VT earthquakes in the last 12 hours. However, the explosions and accompanying ashfall of similar larger magnitude are likely to continue to occur with little or no warning, and the pattern of seismic activity over the last few days is typical of growth and destruction of lava domes. In terms of some considerations with respect to our response to the ongoing eruption, of course, we have to take into account that we have traveled, because of the ongoing pandemic, we have travel restrictions out of Trinidad, and that affects our staff rostering. There's a lack of funding currently for additional monitoring equipment, and this means we're kind of looking for seeking external funds to try to assist with the monitoring equipment, additional monitoring equipment, particularly as stations go down. We're coming to the hurricane season as well as the impacts of the eruption itself on the system. We have increased physical risk to staff, so there's a more heavier demand for remote monitoring equipment. Of course, the limited human resources, so we're combining both technical and scientific staff from both the SRC and the MVO in response to this eruption. We've had to develop new areas of expertise, including risk assessment, products, and reporting of scientific data, as well as education and outreach tools. Of course, there's need for helicopter support continually throughout the eruption, and this is very costly. The possibility of rapid changes in volcanic activity continues to happen throughout the extent of the eruption. And of course, we're planning for an unknown length of eruption. And of course, because the Seismic Research Center is responsible for monitoring seismic and volcanic activity for all of the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean islands, there is the possibility of concurrent or volcanic and seismic unrest in some of the other islands that we're responsible for. So with this, I thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Right. So we'll now move forward to Professor Thomas Wilson. Professor Thomas Wilson is a Professor and Director, Disaster Risk and Resilience, School of Earth and Environment, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. His research interests are in natural hazard and risk assessment with a focus on volcanic impacts to critical infrastructure and primary industries. Professor Wilson has contributed to various volcanic risk reduction initiatives, providing advice on likely impacts and potential mitigation, preparedness and response strategies, including for the United Nations, various governments around the world, and various eruption crises. Professor Wilson, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just look to share my screen here. Okay, can people see my presentation here?
Yes, we can.
Great, sorry, I'm just flicking between here. Okay, so thank you very much for having me on the call today. I just wanted to reiterate everybody else's thoughts around the effects that this volcanic disaster is having on various communities and individuals in the region, and you're very much in our thoughts here in New Zealand. So my presentation will be covering a brief overview of some of the impacts that volcanic hazards can have to critical infrastructure. It's a very large topic and a number of sectors, infrastructure sectors that can be affected. So I've just picked out a few, I guess, key issues, which hopefully will be useful, and we can talk more in the question and answer session. Obviously, I'm from New Zealand, and so I have a weird accent. So if I speak too quickly or I'm not understandable, please just break in and please let me know. Often when New Zealanders get excited, we speak too quickly. So my apologies if that happens. So the way that I'm going to approach this today is to think about this from I guess from a risk perspective. And so with this eruption crisis we have and the impacts that are occurring, the way to perhaps think of the issue is we have the hazard being produced, and in many instances it'll be largely ashfall from the volcano, which is causing problems. And then on the right-hand side here, we have what's exposed. So whether it be people or buildings or infrastructure, and to assess what the impacts might be, we bring those two together through this concept of vulnerability. And the analogy here perhaps is thinking about what are the different attributes that the assets that are exposed and what effect that they may have given the hazard. And so if we can understand that, then that gives insight into the impact, and if we can get a probability of what that impact will be, then we can start thinking about risk. So that's how I'll approach this today. I had this slide in to acknowledge that some of the most severe impacts to infrastructure are often from pyroclastic flows and lahars when we're thinking about volcanic eruptions. I won't run through these videos for the sake of time, but the issues with that are likely to be affecting infrastructure on St. Vincent at the moment, from direct effects from pyroclastic flows and from lahars or volcanic debris flows, they can be extremely damaging. But perhaps if people are interested in more specific information about that, I'd be really happy to chat after the talk about this, or perhaps in the question and answer session. But what I'd like to focus on today is the issue of ashfall, because ashfall, of course, is the most wide spread volcanic hazard, and it's what most communities in the Caribbean are currently being affected from this crisis. As a general comment, ashfall impacts from our experiences around the world, and we've done a lot of research all over the globe looking at these ashfall impacts to infrastructure systems, is that generally ashfalls tend to be disruptive rather than catastrophically damaging. Now, that's not always the case, but as a general observation, that seems to be the issue. So most infrastructure systems, such as power supply, water supply, and telecommunications and so on, will tolerate volcanic ashfalls up to a point, and then there'll be some sort of threshold or tipping point where they can no longer cope. And a nice example might be with water supplies, where if we have an open reservoir, ashfall falling into it, the system will be able to cope with the increased turbidity in the reservoir up until a point where it becomes saturated or unable to cope, and then we have failure. What's important to recognise is that volcanic ashfall has a wide range of physical and chemical properties. I'll speak a little bit more to that in a minute, but the particular combination of the thickness or the volume of ash that's received at a site, the grain size, and the chemical properties of the ash will all have important or potentially important influence on what the impact to an infrastructure system may be. And so when we're thinking about what the impacts to infrastructure systems may be from ashfall, there's a loose relationship between ashfall thickness and the load, or the load of the volume of ash which falls at a particular site. But actually, system performance tends to be much more influenced by the design of the particular infrastructure system, the level of planning that's been undertaken to prepare for the event, and then what actions are actually taken, and are they the correct mitigative actions or not. So that's something very much to keep in mind here. Just very quickly, ash properties. Ash is produced, of course, by these explosive volcanic eruptions, can be very hard and angular, but it can also have this surface coating of soluble salts, which can make it corrosive or electrically conductive. And Claire will talk a little bit more about this later with the implications that this has for health, but similarly, it has similar implications for infrastructure systems too. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that as what those potential chemical effects of the ash can be important to keep in mind here. So experience from around the globe suggests that ashfall is often regarded as quite an exotic or mysterious event, which very rarely tend to be planned for. Usually the most important thing is that people are most concerned about what the potential health impacts will be from a volcanic ashfall. But that will include infrastructure operations, such as, are my water supplies contaminated, and what effect will it have on food supplies and things like that. Without doubt, the next big issue will be what's the direct effect on critical infrastructure systems, aviation, electricity, transportation, and so on. Something which is always comes up often is the potential or the challenges around cleanup and what mitigative actions can be undertaken. It seems like that's occurring here with this event as well. There's a few other issues there. What I wanted to flag early on was that there is an international group of volcano and infrastructure scientists and engineers have put together a ash impacts poster suite, which summarizes the known effects to different infrastructure systems. What are some of the actions that you can do to try and prepare and to respond to ashfalls which have either happened or are coming in? They're designed as a fact-rich, advice-rich resource for a specialized audience. They're not targeted at for the public necessarily, but they're designed for infrastructure managers. And so there's a link that we accelerated the launch of these posters for this particular event, and it's great to see that resource is being used widely. So I'm now going to go into some sector-specific points. And so one of the things that often occurs with ashfalls is impacts to the power system. And so the photo that you can see here on the bottom right is where one of the most common issues occurs when ashfalls fall onto insulators. And when the ashfall falls onto those insulators and accumulates on them, if it becomes slightly wet or slightly damp, it releases some of those soluble salts which are on the surface of the ash, and the ash can become highly electrically conductive. And so if there's not a controlled shutdown, or if, for whatever reason the electricity stays on, is that there can be a what's called a flashover, or it's like a short circuit across the insulator. So that's one of the most common issues which can occur for power systems, especially for both high voltage and for distribution voltages. My understanding on St. Vincent is that there was proactive ash electric network shutdowns, But these can also be issues in other areas which have received ashfalls of, it sort of starts to occur around about 2 to 3 millimeters of ashfall. So it's something to be mindful of. Heavy rainfall will wash the ash off most of the insulators, but sometimes you've just got to be careful with the ash sometimes cementing onto the insulator sheds themselves. One of the other challenges that often occurs is disruption to generator sites, so hydroelectric power schemes, and sometimes thermal power stations where their air intakes can be clogged with ash. So again, something for generators to be mindful of. And every now and then with heavy ashfalls is that there can be line breakage where trees can fall onto lines themselves. We've got a number of these, just to bring up some of these posters here, which we've got 2 separate poster fact sheets, one for transmission and distribution systems and one for power plant operators or for generators. In terms of water treatment supplies, as a general comment, the most vulnerable water supplies will be surface water supplies, for the obvious reason that ashfall can easily contaminate those reservoirs. Ashfall will increase the turbidity of the raw water sources, which can be the major challenge for treatment. But what's quite interesting and worth very much keeping an eye on or be mindful of is that many people elect to clean up their homes or businesses or areas with using water, and that can exhaust the reserves of your municipal supply. So that's an example here on the bottom right with the graph here from an example in Alaska, where after the 1992 Mount Spur eruption, there was a huge demand increase in water supply for the city of Anchorage, and it actually led to partial outage for the municipality or for the town, which caused serious concerns. As a general comment, and I'm not a water chemist, but as a general comment, the experience from around the world suggests that the major effect of ashfall on raw water sources is the increased turbidity rather than changes in chemical composition. So it's very rare that there's hazardous levels of chemicals being introduced into surface water supplies, simply because the dilution effect of the reservoir is so great, and often there's a buffering effect with the bottom of the reservoir as well. But certainly increased or enhanced testing of water is absolutely advisable with surface water supplies. For groundwater supplies, that tends to be much more resilient, and the issue is often more having access to energy, or particularly electricity, to keep the pumps going. And again, another a water poster here to summarize some of the knowledge there. And then there's also a poster on wastewater treatment as well, but I won't speak to that in this talk. One of the major challenges for ashfall, and particularly for infrastructure operations, but also just for the general public, is cleaning up volcanic ash. It's usually extremely challenging and a huge logistical feat. And for areas that have had anything more than several millimeters of ashfall, it usually creates huge volumes that need to be considered. As a general experience and lessons from around the world from multiple settings, is that the prompt cleanup of urban environments is essential to minimize damage and disruption. Ashfall accumulations of only a few millimeters can cause large volumes to be collected and disposed of. And the lesson is certainly that efficient and effective cleanup operations need to be well planned and well coordinated, both with heavy earth moving machinery and councils or municipal authorities, but particularly with the communities themselves, because often they'll have the most capacity and potentially the local knowledge around how to best deal with that ash is important. But working out where they need support to enable that cleanup operation is very important. Here's just a screenshot of the poster that we've got some suggestions around how to approach cleanup operations. And a point that I was keen to flag is that For very thin amounts of ashfall, often it's sometimes easier to clean up just the sensitive sites and leave much of the rest of it to either be washed into the land or accumulated away. But where there's sort of more than 2 to 3 millimeters of ashfall, often that's where a large-scale cleanup is required. And certainly when you're looking at maybe several inches of ashfall, that's where significant resource needs to be provided to assist community operations with cleaning areas up. This is just an example of some of the suggested advice around cleaning up properties and thinking about how to plan a large-scale cleanup operation, and just basically gives a workflow of suggestion how to move through to or affect that cleanup operation. A couple of points to note here is property cleanup is a very large logistical challenge for many people. There's a lot of health and safety considerations that may need to be thought of there, but also where to store ash so it can be efficiently cleaned up is essential. I think the heavy earth moving logistics probably are fairly obvious here, but the point around disposal is often a big challenge. And the temptation is often to dump ash into municipal waste sites. But certainly our experience is that consider a site that isn't going to use up your valuable landfill, but one that will be able to be easily stabilized to prevent further remobilization by wind or rain. And think about a vegetation cap might be important there as well. So again, lots of examples that I can share with you if you're interested in this topic. Just a couple of final points. HVAC systems such as heating, venting, and cooling. There's been a lot of interest in this over the last couple of decades around what ashfall effects can have. In short, having a split system where there's not direct air being ingested from the outside into your interior of your building is probably the best system by far. And we've experimented with a number of different filtration techniques to try and reduce the effects of what the ingestion of ash into the condenser units will be. But as a general rule, again, it's not the case always, but as a general rule, simple measures such as simply putting a hood or some sort of protective shield over the intake of the condenser has quite considerable benefits or can help reduce the clogging and the load that goes onto those HVAC systems. But again, very much dependent on system design and what ashfall volume and grain size that you're receiving. So again, this, in simple terms, experiment around with what might work for you at your particular site, but any sort of basic filtration and any sort of physical hood or shielding seems to be the most effective rapid mitigations. And just a final point around telecommunications. We have not observed or seen any modern telecommunication systems have any significant transmission disruption from ashfall effects. If you've seen any in this event, I'd be very interested. But the most common issues tends to be overloading of the network due to very high usages, or if there's electricity disruption and the network has to shut down as a result, or there's an HVAC failure for heating and cooling. And just to come towards the end of my talk, here's some advices, some sources to find further advice. I gave you the link for the posters before, and I'll give it to you again. But this website's almost like a little online encyclopedia of potential ash impacts to all sorts of different sectors, including infrastructure, but also into agriculture and some other areas like buildings and things like that, which can be really useful as well. So this is my final slide here, and just some more of those links that are quite useful for thinking about potential impacts, and most importantly, what useful advice might be there available for you to use to protect and respond from these types of events. Thank you very much. That's me, and I just need to work out how to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wilson.
Great. Have I stopped sharing my screen? Okay, great, perfect.
Yes, you have, yeah. Thank you. We'll move next to Professor Claire Horwell. She's a professor of Geo-health at Durham University, UK. She's the founder and director of the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network, an organization which provides public information on the health impacts of eruptions. Professor Horwell has been involved in many eruption responses, advising the World Health Organization and the UK, US, and other governments. She also helps health agencies to prepare to respond to eruption crises. Her research focuses on the respiratory hazards of volcanic emissions and on community protection. She is an environmental scientist and a volcanologist by training. Over to you, Professor Horwell.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Okay, I'll just wait for the screen share option to come up. Okay. All right, can you see that?
Yeah.
Great, okay, thank you very much. So yeah, in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about the health impacts of volcanic ash and gas, which collectively we might call volcanic emissions. And I'm going to cover a range of topics, and then at the end, I'm going to show you all the other topics that I couldn't cover in just 10 minutes. So I'm very happy to answer questions on these afterwards. Okay, so what is volcanic ash? Well, we've heard a little bit about that so far, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of respiratory health. So volcanic ash is particles of rock. This comes from the magma itself becoming fragmented, and actually from the volcano, because as we've seen, parts of the volcano, including the old dome, are getting disrupted and incorporated into these explosions. And the size of ash, as a kind of formal definition, is less than 2 millimeters in diameter. But when we start thinking about actually inhaling ash, so getting ash into our lungs, actually we're interested in much, much smaller particles. Really, we can breathe in particles that are roughly 100 micrometers or smaller into the respiratory system. Now, to try and put that in context, let's think about the size of a human hair. And if you took a cross section through a hair, it's really, really small. And actually, the size of particles that can get into the top part of your lungs is probably about the width of a human hair. But to get deep into our lungs is even smaller. And you might have heard about people talking about PM10 and PM2.5. That is particulate matter less than 10 micrometers and less than 2 micrometers in diameter. So these are much smaller than a human hair, and this is the size of tiny particles that can get deep, deep into your lung and that can irritate your lungs and potentially make you ill. And so we think about these tiny particles. You can't actually see them with the naked eye, but of course, when there's a cloud of ash and there's billions of particles, then you can see the cloud. One thing I wanted to say right at the start is that sometimes people describe ash because they understand that it's corrosive and abrasive to paintwork and this kind of thing. They imagine that when it gets into your body and into your lungs, that it's going to somehow lacerate your lungs and cut them up. And that's especially because one of the composite types of ash is volcanic glass. And this is not the kind of glass like if you smashed a window. And I want to make the point that this is not at the size of particles that gets into your lungs. This is not sharp particles that's going to cut you up. So you don't need to worry about that. So I also wanted to talk about volcanic gases. When we actually have an eruption and there is gas coming out of the volcano, it is always a mixture of multiple different kinds of gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen chloride. And my apologies, I've used the British spellings here, but I guess we've got people from across the Caribbean here who maybe use US spellings as well. So the gas that we're probably most worried about from the health perspective is sulfur dioxide, and I'll come on to that in a minute. The thing about sulfur dioxide is that it can travel for a very, very long distance. In fact, we've heard of the plume of sulfur dioxide reaching India. But as it travels, it will also be interacting with the atmosphere. And as it does that, it will create or it will transform into something called sulfate aerosol, which you may know as sulfuric acid droplets. And this is a type of particulate matter. It will be picked up on air quality monitoring particulate instruments, but also these can be particularly acidic and irritating to the human lungs. So let's go back to ash. What might be harmful about inhaling volcanic ash? Well, ash actually has several different characteristics that we can measure, which give us an idea of the health hazard of the ash. So first of all, the particles have to actually be small enough to get into the lungs, as I just described. So a fraction of the ash really has to be less than 100 micrometers in diameter or even smaller. And we're particularly worried about the very smallest particles, the PM particles getting deep into your lungs. Sometimes ash can contain minerals that in other circumstances, like in industry, we've seen some toxic responses for workers. And crystalline silica is one of those minerals. So we usually monitor the ash just to check if this volcano is producing crystalline silica or not. We also worry about iron in the ash. It's possible for iron to react with hydrogen peroxide, which is naturally available in the lungs, to form something called a hydroxyl radical, which can potentially damage the cells around where the particle falls in the lung. But as Tom described, the ash itself can have a sort of acidic surface to it, and there may be elements on the surface of the ash which, when the ash comes into contact with water, may come off the surface or leach into the water supply. So when you test water supplies which have been contaminated with ash, you might test for fluoride, aluminium, iron, manganese, zinc and copper. So they would be the recommended elements for testing. And then if there are extra resources available, then also additionally, we would analyze for arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, mercury, nickel and lead. And of course, we check the turbidity of the water, so how cloudy it is, and also the pH. I guess one other thing to think about is that often we live in polluted environments anyway. Now, I suspect that the Caribbean islands are not the same as some of the major cities around the world where volcanoes erupt nearby. But, you know, some cities are highly polluted with anthropogenic pollutants, so urban vehicle pollutants, for example, and then people get ashfall on top of that. And so you may get a kind of synergistic or cumulative additive effect of being exposed to lots of pollutants. But I suspect that's less of a problem in the lovely Eastern Caribbean. So I've talked about what might make ash hazardous, and now I'll talk about the health impacts of ash and also gases. So for both ash and gas, when we think about what might happen right away, which we call acute exposures, we may think about a range of different respiratory symptoms. First of all, we might get irritation of our airways from breathing in some of this ash and gas. So you might find that you have a bit of cough or phlegm that you wouldn't normally have. If you're breathing in some of the sulfur dioxide, you might also get a headache, for example, or feel a bit like a brain fuzz. But if you are not a healthy person already, and if you already have pre-existing respiratory or possibly cardiovascular diseases, then your existing symptoms could be made worse. And for lung diseases, that means you may find that you have wheezing or shortness of breath. And if you're an asthmatic, there is a danger of asthma attacks. So people with pre-existing diseases really need to make sure they have their medication with them and that they're talking to their doctor if their symptoms are getting worse. Now, we also need to think about whether there are any long-term impacts. And by this, I mean chronic, so diseases that develop over a long time and probably last a long time as well, respiratory diseases. Now, this is something that has been a concern at other volcanic eruptions, and this concern really comes from industrial exposures to mineral dusts, which contain similar minerals like crystalline silica. At the moment, we have no evidence that volcanic ash can cause these chronic respiratory diseases, and that's a very important point to make. Partly, we have so little evidence because actually not many studies have been done. It's quite rare to have an eruption where the communities are exposed for long enough to actually make it worthwhile doing long-term studies, because we just think the risk is quite low. Other issues that may come up in relation to health is you may get sore eyes. The ash itself can be quite abrasive on the eyes, and if you rub your eyes, then you may get quite sore eyes and even scratched eyes. That can lead to conjunctivitis. And the ash also, because of its acidic surface, can cause soreness or rashes on the skin. So we do recommend wearing eye goggles if possible, taking out contact lenses, and wearing long-sleeved and long-legged clothes. And of course, there's the potential for contamination of water supplies, which Tom alluded to earlier. So those are the kind of internal body injuries, but of course you can also get injuries from volcanic ash in a number of different ways, mainly related to accidents. And so one problem is that when ash falls on roofs, they can cause roof collapse. And that could happen with perhaps more than 20 centimeters of dry ash or 10 centimeters of saturated wet ash from rainfall. And you can see an image on the right that was taken by the Seismic Research Centre showing some collapsed buildings in St. Vincent. So if you were inside a building that collapsed, you may well suffer traumatic injury or even be killed. And if you are on your roof trying to clean the ash off and you collapse through that roof, then obviously you could also suffer injury or death. Ash can be incredibly slippery, and that means that it's not uncommon to have driving accidents due to loss of tyre traction, and it's just really important that people try and minimise driving until the ash has been cleared away. But there can be injuries also from other kinds of cleanup activities as well, and slipping in various ways. For example, rather than falling through a roof, it's quite common for people to actually fall off roofs if they're trying to clean their roofs because of the slipperiness. So I have now a number of slides about what you might actually do to protect yourself. These all come from the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network, which is an organisation which I direct, where for the past 20 years or so, we have been developing evidence-based information for the public and for stakeholder partners. So we have a series of pamphlets and leaflets. One of them is about how to protect yourself from ash. And the main thing to do really is to remove yourself from ash and gas environments. And unless you can leave the area, the best thing to do is to stay indoors if possible. And that means closing doors and windows. And to do that, you might seal up large gaps or spaces to the outdoors, and you might use plastic sheeting or rolled up towels. The problem is that when you start to do that, it can get very uncomfortable inside, especially in tropical environments, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A very great relevance to the current audience, it's really important that if you use any kind of air purifier or conditioner, that you don't have it on a setting to suck in air from the outside. So these should only be used if there's a recirculate setting. If the environment indoors becomes ashy, then it's also important to try and gently clean away the ash using damp cloths, for example, so that you're not continuously exposed. There is a problem with some vacuum cleaners in that a lot of them have an exhaust, and when that exhaust is happening, you can actually get fine ash being blown back into the indoor space. And this can be mitigated because some vacuum cleaners actually have a HEPA filter on them to stop that happening, but not all ones do. So it really depends on the quality of the vacuum cleaner. So if you are staying indoors for a long time, you need to make sure that the environment stays safe for you. And so we recommend that you don't cook or use indoor appliances which produce smoke. Cigarette smoking should be minimized, and that you don't use unflued gas heaters or other bringing in, for example, outdoor appliances such as gas patio heaters or barbecues. And this is due to the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. To go back to clean up from roofs, we've just been developing a whole set of guidelines on this over the last 24 hours, which we hope to have at the URL at the bottom of this slide within the next day or so. I'm not going to go through all of these now, but you can read through them, or you can hopefully check back on the website in the next 24 hours to understand more about how to safely clean up from roofs. I'm just going to talk very briefly about respiratory protection. I'm going to start with gas and then move on to ash, because they are very different. The first thing to say is that we do not recommend that people use face masks to try and protect themselves from volcanic gases. The face masks that people might be wearing anyway for COVID or to try and protect from the ash, so in other words, particulate filters, are not effective for gases. There are commercial masks for filtering gases like the one you can see here. They're not disposable and they're not recommended for the public. And this is because the safe use of gas masks requires correct mask and or filter cartridge selection, fit testing, and training on the mask's correct use, maintenance, and storage. So you can wear masks to protect from the ash particles and the sulfate aerosol particles. We've just a few years ago finished a big study actually testing the best kinds of masks against volcanic ash, and the best ones, it's the same as with industry, workers in dusty industries, and the same for COVID. The best kind of masks are the N95 or N99 industry certified masks. So these need to be well fitting as well. And yeah, I know that some humanitarian agencies are sending some to St. Vincent at the moment. More commonly available is the surgical mask. And actually, we found that these are quite good at filtering particles, but of course, they're not designed to fit well to the face. So you can do things to improve the fit. Certainly in COVID, people have started to twist the ear loops, for example. But also we found that if you tied an extra piece of light cloth, like a light scarf over the top, it can hold it better to the face. We also tested cloths, and we found that, for example, bandanas worn over the nose or mouth were really ineffective at filtering particles. And of course, they just don't fit well either. So these should be a last resort if you can't get hold of a proper face mask. If you fold a piece of cloth, it definitely does improve its filtration, but we found that wetting the cloth does not. So you can find lots of resources that give you all this information on the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network website, including little leaflets on how to fit a face mask that should be given out by the humanitarian agencies when they're handing out face masks, and posters to go in bulletin boards and this kind of thing. Now, I only had 10 to 15 minutes, so there's a huge array of health information that I have not covered. For example, what's happening about syndromic surveillance to look at the actual and document the actual health impacts that are happening. What about air quality monitoring, drinking water monitoring, ash analysis to look at what it's actually made of for health hazard assessment, hygiene and wash issues, evacuation and health, and also, of course, dealing with a COVID pandemic and an eruption at the same time. Now, I can answer questions on some of these separately, and we also have some advice available on the IVHHN website. If you're not familiar with the website, this is what the front page looks like. We've got 4 sections now. The 4th one was made available this week in response to this crisis. And so you can go in here to find briefing notes on air quality monitoring, water management, and health impacts in general. And we will have the cleanup health and safety on there very soon. But the main place you'd probably want to go is public information, which is where we keep all the video resources and printable resources, and also possibly into scientific protocols if you want to know, for example, how to collect ash samples for analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Horwell. Thank you very much. We will now switch to Dr. Stephen Ramroop. Dr. Stephen Ramroop is the Rotary District 7030 Disaster Preparedness Coordinator. He's a former Chief Executive Officer of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management of the Ministry of National Security in Trinidad. He started in 2011 and served in that post for 6 years. He was instrumental in implementing disaster risk reduction policies and protocols at all levels in Trinidad and Tobago, and served at the SEDIMA level as one of the directors in his capacity as National Disaster Coordinator. He served as an intergovernmental expert in the UN Working Group to develop the indicators for the monitoring and evaluation of disaster risk reduction programs and policies in all UN member states in accordance with the UNDRR Sendai Strategy 2015 to 2030. Dr. Ramroop has been developing certificate courses in disaster risk reduction at both local universities in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Ramroop is a Rotarian from the Rotary Club of San Fernando South. He has served at all levels as Director, Treasurer, Secretary, President, Assistant Governor, and as District Governor for the Caribbean Clubs in 2012 to 2013. He now serves as a District Disaster Chair, and in this capacity is currently coordinating relief efforts to St. Vincent. Dr. Ramroop, I'm going to make you a presenter just now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to say a few words on sort of the response that is happening with respect to this hazard. According to what one of our previous speakers was talking about in terms of risk, we have been looking at a risk-based approach to our response to the volcano, in the sense that we knew the hazards, we looked at the vulnerabilities in terms of the communities, and with the help of key stakeholders such as UWI, Seismic Research Center, and other key agencies in the Caribbean and in St. Vincent, we were able to identify the populations that were at risk and develop some strategies to prevent problems if they were affected in a very severe manner, like what happened. And basically, it's the denominator of the equation for risk, which is capacity. And I think that we all know, as small island states, we are very vulnerable when it comes to most of the hazards that affect us. But in particular, our capacity is a problem. And I think that that is what happened a few months ago as part of my role as a Rotarian, as chair of the Preparedness division of the disaster responses and preparedness of the clubs of the Caribbean. My role was to make sure that we were prepared and to try to get countries prepared for their particular hazards. And what we did is that we looked at the established systems that were present in St. Vincent. In this particular case, the National Emergency Management Organization, NEMO. And it all started really in the Caribbean through CARICOM in 2004, when we developed SEDIMA, which was originally the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency, and it was converted into the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And what CARICOM did at the time is that it invited all Caribbean nations, including the countries of Suriname, Guyana, on the table, and requested that they all develop these national platforms or national disaster agencies. In Trinidad, I was the head of one of them, which is the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, ODPM. So in Trinidad, our national agency was ODPM. In St. Vincent is NERO. And therefore in other countries, we had similar agencies, and that is what CARICOM did in 2004. In 2005, United Nations formed what was called United Nations ISDR, International Disaster Risk Agency. And what we did is all member states came together and developed what at that time was the Hyogo strategy. And as you just heard, in 2015, it was converted into, it was redeveloped into the Sendai strategy. Now, what is all of this? Basically, what it does, it prepares countries to respond to their particular hazards. And it allows a reporting mechanism through, as the Caribbean, through SEDIMA, and through SEDIMA to the United Nations, in such a way that we are able to try to develop strategies to mitigate most of our disasters in a reasonable way. But the small island states, as you can well imagine, we would not have that overall capacity. So what we did, as I said, through Rotary, is that we had one of the Rotarians in the country who was very experienced and very good at disaster risk. And he was able to sit at the table with the government and NERO. And he was our contact with all the clubs of St. Vincent. And of course, by virtue of our organization, Rotary, within the Caribbean, 7030, District 7030, we were able to have a WhatsApp group where we began to share needs and assessments, share advice and recommendations to the St. Vincent team. And we involved other persons within the other Rotary clubs in adjacent countries. So we pretty much started to be on the table for when we were informed that there was most likely going to be an eruption. And many of the Rotarians began working in the communities to begin to liaise and engage with many of the persons who would most likely be affected, which is out of those 20,000 persons who we identified were the at-risk persons. So over the period of the volcanic eruption from the 6th of April to now, that chat has been very busy. And one of the biggest response needs we had was obviously the evacuation issues. As the Prime Minister of St. Vincent indicated, it was very difficult to get everybody out. And as a matter of fact, quite late, many persons who were within the red area were putting a lot of the first responders at risk because they were not moving out voluntarily. Thus, there was some weakness in the legislation, which we had identified before, but unfortunately it could not change, in that there's no mandatory evacuation requirements unless a state of emergency or curfew was called. Since this did not happen, Rotarians were able to coerce or to help a lot of people come out of those areas, because a lot of people just did not want to leave their homes for security reasons, for agricultural reasons. A lot of these people have crops around the areas, so there were some problems there. But the biggest problem we had was COVID-19 in a sense, because a lot of the designated shelters, we couldn't pack people into those shelters. So the Rotarians were on the ground trying to assist a lot of persons who identified families in the south or friends in the south who they were able to shelter in place at those other places. So there was a lot of work being done in terms of shelter. As you can well imagine, in most emergencies, in most particular types of hazards, health, shelter, water, security are very important. And shelter in this case was very important in moving people. Displacement was going to be one of the biggest short-term problems, because after the disaster, if anybody ever went to Montserrat, you would realize that there quite a lot of that country, that part of the country where the volcano erupted in Montserrat, when you go to the areas, you see that people just can't go back to the area. And that has happened for many, many years. So there's going to be some displacement. There's going to be some long-term effects of that displacement. And of course, there's going to be some socio-economic problems. That obviously is what we are currently looking in the medium term and long term. So those are some of the responses that the government and the key stakeholders, which includes Rotary and the Rotary Club network, in terms of rebuilding the communities of St. Vincent in the longer term. Again, if you will look at the short term, water was a big problem initially in terms of potable drinking water. Now they have exceeded the amount of water that has come into the country. They are asking to hold a bit because it's so much, and a lot of it were bottled water. One of the problems that we found in Dominica and even in some of the other islands like Bahamas, when we had the disasters, which were the hydrometeorological type of hazards impacts, we found that excessive water also gives you excessive bottles. And these plastic bottles also is going to create an environmental hazard, because the disposal of that is going to be a problem. And that is something that, again, is going to be a medium to long-term problem that we're going to have to deal with as one of the impacts coming out of the humanitarian effort of water. But water, again, is essential, potable water. What we had done in Trinidad is we had recommended that bladders be sent across, and there are a couple of water makers that could convert seawater into potable drinking water, and the bladders could be loaded up into pickups. So these are some of the contingencies that were put in so that is to reduce the amount of bottled water. But again, there was so much love and humanitarian need to send water and other supplies such as canned food and goods, and a number of things were on the list, and that was well done. there's been an outpouring through the Rotary system, as well as some of the other multilateral and bilateral government relationships. And of course, a lot of the key stakeholders in the country, for example, a lot of the large supermarket chains and hardware chains, as well as some of the governmental organizations, like in terms of the World Bank and some of the EU countries, they were also through that system, they were able to get funding and finance. Initially, in terms of the response, we had requested that most people send cash because we hope that the use of cash within St. Vincent to purchase items that were needed within St. Vincent will also stimulate the economy. In terms of the other short-term, again, health, we had a problem where we were finding that a lot of the shelters and some of the hospitals, there was a shortage of nebulizers, and there were an increase in terms of the asthmatic, the children who had asthma. A lot of the adults who had chronic respiratory diseases, there were a shortage of nebulizers. So the Rotary clubs requested that we send nebulizers, and that was done pretty quickly to try to mitigate some of the problems. So to end, what I would like to say is that because of our limited capacity as small islands, we got a lot of assistance through the Rotary Club. The Rotary Club are people on the ground in the communities. We have a Rotaract type. We have a Rotaract Club, which are what we should say, the younger Rotarians, and they have been very instrumental in trying to garner, again, humanitarian relief and support, but as well as in St. Vincent to be on the ground. They're doing a lot of deliveries, shelter support, shelter management, and this is what a lot of the response to that particular disaster is happening right now. So in terms of the long term, again, we'd have to look, as Dr. said, as been identified before by Professor and our previous speaker, there are going to be some long-term complications with surveillance, follow-up. Ash cleanup is going to be a big thing, but again, it's an island. So we're hoping that more, money in terms of trucks and pumps to pump the seawater to help a lot with the washing away of the ashes from the roadways and the movement of the ash from the areas into the disposal sites. These are going to be strategically done in assistance with NERO. Some of the key stakeholders, and Rotary will be on the table because we have our representative sitting with NERO, and of course with the other islands giving support in terms of the medium and long-term response to this hazard impact. So thank you, and well, I guess we go to questions, and anybody has any questions, I can answer them there.
Thank you, Dr. Ramroop. We're actually going to have all of the panelists come back to participate in the question and answer session. Those persons who are on the GoToMeeting platform, you can type your questions in the question section on the control panel. And those who are viewing on the UETV website, there's a chat function there that you can use to submit your questions. All questions will be moderated, so we will ensure that we do not duplicate questions. Just waiting for Professor Wilson. There we go. So we do have a number of questions, which we will. I'm going to try and identify who is the most appropriate person to answer them. So bear with me. Professor Horwell, I'm going to start with you, please. What measures should the general public take against sulfur dioxide emissions, if any?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, yeah, so as I mentioned in my talk, the best thing to do is, if you're feeling affected by the gases, is to try and remove yourself from them. Now, most people won't be particularly bothered by the gases, actually, and it's not a problem. But if you are sensitive, for example, if you're asthmatic and if you can't leave the area, then going indoors, sealing the doors and windows where you can, and keeping your medication with you is what you should be doing, and talking to your doctor if your condition gets worse.
Thank you. This next question is for both Dr. Joseph and Dr. Ramroop. Dr. Joseph, you mentioned issues with funding for the cleanup support. And Dr. Ramroop, you also mentioned some issues that somehow Rotary is responding. So the question is, what avenues are being used to mobilize funding of monitoring equipment needed by the SRC?
So we have been engaged with SEDIMA. We're part of the response mechanism to the eruption, and through SEDIMA, they've reached out to a number of development partners, and these include people like, organizations like the CDB, Caribbean Development Bank. We've received some assistance from CRIF, donations from Halliburton of tilt meters. So these are some of the these are some of the avenues that have opened up to us. However, this is just, you know, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because this allows us to be able to have spares to replace what has been damaged by the explosions that have taken place. And as soon as that is over, we will have to get, you know, until it's safe to do so, we can get in and repair what's been damaged. But also remember, we're planning for a long-term response to the eruption, to support mobilization of staff, as well as to prepare for things like the hurricane season, which is, you know, close upon us. And of course, you know what happens during that time with respect to equipment.
Dr. Ramroop, you want to follow up anything on that?
Well, I can't add much except to say that Doctor has identified some of the key governmental and key stakeholders at the level of the developmental partners, and that is a very important part of all governments in their association with CDIMA, because that's what CARICOM set up CDIMA to do in the first place. All right, to make sure that you coordinate and identify the needs that are required. There are some multilateral and bilateral partners that will also come around, because clearly United States through US aid and some of the other US OFDA and US State Department, all of them will come later on when the ambassadors are given the understanding of what is needed in terms of St. Vincent requesting that. And I think that once the Prime Minister meets with his team later on as we go forward through NERO being the advisory team, and all the other key stakeholders, Rotary facilitates, and it's an international organization. So once items or once certain things are needed, it's easier for us to look at facilitation in terms of getting those types of funding. Once you know the figure value and some of the things that could be sourced within the Caribbean, obviously. I mean, we have France in the Caribbean, and a lot of times we forget that. And that is true the Martinique and the Guadeloupes and the French Guiana. And that's a big partner in the Caribbean. And I think that is sometimes that we do tend to forget them, but they're very, very helpful, and they have a lot of resources, right, in terms of that. So I think that is something that we need to look at. A lot of times I've been involved in disaster responses, for example, in St. Lucia and St. Vincent before, and the Martinique helicopters have actually reached, when we landed in the airports there to bring relief from Trinidad, they were there before us. All right, so it's very important to understand that, and I think that we need to look at their support because they're very quick through French Guiana and in that aspect. In terms of the other types of funding, we're going to have to do a disaster a DANA, which is called a needs assessment, and we will definitely have to do a DALA, which is a loss assessment, very soon, to begin to look at how we go forward. That's the only way that we will know exactly what we want. So as very soon, the military in Trinidad, our Minister of National Security will be sending another team, and a lot of them have been trained in doing damage and needs assessments and damage and loss assessments. So when we get a good DANA and DALA assessments, then we can actually plan what are some of our short, medium, and long-term needs that will be required in terms of health infrastructure as well as environment as we go forward.
Thank you both for that. I know that as Caribbean people, we want to help as quickly as we can, but it's not always physically possible or practical. You raise the issue with the water, where you get a lot of water and it ends up not being distributed when other needs are not satisfied. So thank you for that. Professor Wilson, there's going to be a bit of a cross between yourself and Professor Horwell on this next question, but I'm going to start with you. What is acid rain? Is it harmful to people, crops, animals, and surface water collection systems?
So in the context of volcanic emissions, when a volcanic eruption occurs, there can be a lot of acidic gases which are released from the volcano, and that can mix with atmospheric water, so clouds and other water that's in the atmosphere. And when that rains out or precipitates out, the rainfall can have a lower pH or be acidic. So depending on the concentration of the acidic components of the rainfall, that can cause some problems for vegetation and water collection facilities. Typically, it's only for areas that are close to the volcano. So within, actually, I won't give a distance, but usually relatively close. I'm not familiar with the situation, particularly on St. Vincent, but I guess there could be potentially some issues. I'll perhaps leave it to Claire to talk about what the health protections that can be done there. But with respect to infrastructure systems, if you're usually for very large surface water reservoirs, this is not a problem at all. So the buffering capacity or the dilution effect of the reservoirs usually mitigates that quite easily, and usually you don't even see a signal or any turbidity, pH change. But the one issue is if you have rainfall collection for your water supply at your house. So if you're collecting rain from the roof, then you just need to be cautious around if there's heavy ashfall or very gassy emissions from the volcano, that sometimes that may lead to a contamination or a slight contamination of your water supply. Claire, I was leading into perhaps ways to manage some of those aspects there. Perhaps that's the place to hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot more to say regarding health, apart from, of course, the drinking water supplies need to be buffered. So when the drinking water is being decontaminated from the ash anyway, it will be filtered, there'll be some microbial clearance from it, and also they will be checking the pH of the water and buffering it as necessary. In terms of other health problems, the rain would have to be really quite acidic for you to really feel it as a kind of burn on your skin. So, but we recommend wearing long clothes anyway. But maybe Dr. Joseph has something better to say about the situation on St. Vincent itself.
Joseph, you wanna?
This is with respect to the hazards of acid rain.
Yeah.
Yes. So for right now, I think there's been limited rainfall, but when that happens, unfortunately, the biggest impact wouldn't be so much from the SO2 with the acid rain, but really and truly the impacts of lahars, and so a lot of that SO2 would be washed out and incorporated into the lahars, and and these things would cause tremendous damage, particularly around the flanks of the volcano, by remobilizing these thick mud flows, and that this can bury little villages, destroy the infrastructure. But what also happens is it fills in the valleys and the flanks around the volcano. And this can in turn change the way in which the pyroclastic flow and surges are able to flow. So because it fills in these channels, it makes it easier for the impacts of the pyroclastic flow and surges to reach further runouts and faster, because there's no that navigation of the topography is a lot easier for these flows. So so that's the biggest challenge there, I would say.
All right, thank you for that. We have one here, which is a bit of an up in the air, but something that is of great interest to everybody. When will it be safe to use your car's air conditioning system? What advice would you give to somebody who's driving on a road where there's a lot of ash deposit? Windows down, mask on, AC on, mask on? How do you go?
Well, the best advice there is if you can avoid driving your car on ashy roads, that's the best risk management strategy, to use some jargon. The ingestion of ash into the vehicle's engine, and particularly the radiator and air filters, usually is what will cause some challenges for the vehicle. So if you do have to use your car, you want to try and keep all the windows up and manage reduce the amount of ash ingestion into the atmosphere of the car or the area that you're in. You want to reduce your speed. Ash deposits can be very, very slippery, both when they're dry and when they're wet. And also the remobilization of ash deposits when the car is moving can be very voluminous. And so that's very bad for other road users, but also for neighboring houses or communities that are close to the road. They're going to get that ash ingestion for them. So the best advice is, if you don't need to do car travel, please don't. But if you absolutely do have to, then drive slowly, keep yourself masked up, and monitor your engine temperature, because that'll be a good indication as whether your air filter is blocking up or not. Whether you use your air conditioning, I guess make a judgment call would be the easiest way to summarize that. If you turn your fan on to a low extent and you've got ash being blown into the car, well, I'd suggest turn it off. But just work out what best works, and just try and manage it.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Professor Horwell, question here for you. What are the health risks if persons are constantly inhaling the ash particles, sulfur, etc.? Most people don't have access to proper masks at this time.
Yeah, so for relatively short-term exposures, and by that I'm meaning days to weeks, possibly even months, for healthy people, really there are not many health risks. It's uncomfortable and it's a nuisance, and it's nasty to have ash in your throat and to make you cough, and to feel unwell with that. That's not nice at all, but it's not really going to do you any long-term harm. Your body's got really good ways of removing ash from the body, and every time you cough, you're bringing out actually what you already breathed in. So it's not really a problem. It's a really good idea to reduce your exposure as much as you possibly can, but you don't need to be worried that you're going to get really, really sick if you're breathing in some of this ash over the next few weeks. And you only have to look at the communities on Montserrat who were exposed frequently to ash from 1995 through to 2011, really, and lots of studies have been done. They're all fine. There was some increase in asthma in children that was measured, and we do recommend that you try and reduce children's exposure, as well as other susceptible people like the elderly and people with existing respiratory disease. For most people in the population, it's not going to be much more than being uncomfortable.
Thank you. Dr. Joseph, one here which may or may not be in your remit at this stage. Can anyone give an indication of the impact of volcanic ash on the informal, unengineered infrastructure in St. Vincent? Has the intrinsic and vulnerability characteristics of these types of infrastructure been examined? Is there a need for regulating and updating building codes in St. Vincent, taking into consideration this secondary hazard?
So I think that Mr. Ramroop addressed some of this, in his presentation, when he was mentioning that there are currently ongoing impact assessments being done. So this isn't complete, and by no means will it happen very quickly. It's an ongoing thing. Yeah, and I believe this week they're mobilizing through SEDEMA a team to start that. So this would not be something that's very, would be readily available, because they have to go through each sector. And right now, especially in the red zone, it's not accessible because of the dangers. So this would not be complete until many months. They can do different zones, but in terms of a complete assessment, this will not be completed until it's safe to enter the red zone. Although some preliminary impacts based on the assessment, based on the satellite imagery and so on, can be done in terms of the long-term money and repairs and so on needed to do that. It will be a while before that is carried out. So I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything, Dr. Ramroop?
No, you're correct. And I think that, Thomas would probably have an idea of in a more developed country with proper building codes and whatever, but in the Caribbean, where a lot of our housing stock is not even regulated and very poor standards, even for hurricanes and storms, for what is going to happen with respect to the ash, even on the roofs. There are 12,775 persons right now displaced, and as to how much of those are going to go back into their homes, that's going to be a big problem as we go forward. Then if we are to build houses for them or temporary shelters, that's another issue, right? What are we where are we going to build them, and how are we going to develop that infrastructure to cater for that amount of people, especially with this COVID and the variants coming along. So it's going to be, we're going to have a lot of stakeholders who will have to come together. Of course, NERO, I think they're up to the task, because they have had a lot of policies even from before. A lot of their contingency plans were on stream, and I think that I can speak now. I look at the chat, and I see just a few minutes ago, one of the Rotarians asking for a lady who has a child who has no crib and no mattress, and they're asking for mattresses. So this is still going on as we speak right now, and that's a few minutes ago on the chat. So while we're dealing with this issue, some of the longer-term response will, as Dr. Joseph said, as the team comes in from SEDIMA within this week, and I know that our minister has indicated that they have requested us some more military personnel go across. I think that with the Dana and the dollars coming up, we would have to look more carefully at how this is going to happen. And of course, I guess, Professor Wilson, you would have an idea of what has happened before. And I think that this is where we would obviously have to look at some of the best practices. And one of the things that the Sendai strategy has clearly indicated, as well as SEDIMA strategy, is that we need to mitigate, and we need to mitigate whilst we're responding, so that both structural and non-structural mitigation for the next 100 years disaster from the volcano, we need to put that in place right now, and probably use this opportunity to mitigate structurally and non-structurally for the hurricane season, which is coming up not too far from now. So I think that those are some of the assessments that we'd have to go forward with.
Thank you. We have a question here from a listener who found out about the GNS in New Zealand while doing their master's research a decade ago. So this is for you, Professor Wilson. What research programs, projects are offered by the GNS that can be accessed by academics in St. Vincent or the Caribbean region in order for us to be conversant with current best practices and knowledge of volcanic risk reductions, disaster management, etc.?
So what we've been trying to, maybe for some context for everybody, New Zealand, along with several other nations, spends a considerable or a large amount of research time thinking about the impacts of volcanic activity and what some of the risk reduction strategies are. We try to network into the international community as much as possible, much like many of the countries in the Caribbean. New Zealand's very small and doesn't have specialties in everything. And so, for example, we've accelerated the rollout of those ASH posters, which I mentioned in my presentation. And that's like a summary of a lot of the knowledge, I guess, that's been accumulated from those activities. My understanding is that there's a number of connection points with Dr. Joseph's group. providing some informal support in terms of connections there. But if there's anything specific that anyone would like, which New Zealand or I guess any of the groups around the world can provide, feel free to send me an email and I'd be more than happy to connect you with the right, or what are hopefully the right people to connect with. I just wanted to make a final point. I think that the Seismic Research Centre is really well and world renowned for the people and the leadership that it takes in this area. So you're in very good hands with the volcanological group there. And as Claire and others have been explaining, there's a lot of effort by the international science community to try and provide support, knowledge and networks to help individuals who are on the, and particularly locals on the ground responding to this crisis. So I think it's really important that as much as possible it's led from local institutions, but as I said, we're really happy to support as much as possible.
And Dr. Joseph, would you like to offer additional comments?
Thank you, Tom. And I endorse what both Tom and Claire have said in terms of the immediate response to the eruption, well, the ongoing response in terms of the monitoring and the advice to NEMO, etc. While it may be under our responsibility, we do have many collaborators and people who assist with respect to the response, as well as a number of agencies, USGS, FEDAP, etc., who've really provided a lot of assistance through donation of equipment and expertise in terms of the response. So it really is for lack of a better word, a global effort at providing the services necessary to the government of St. Vincent with respect to support for the recovery of the island.
And in terms of information that can be accessed by the academics, the USC would be a good resource for them to go to? The SRC, sorry?
Sorry, in terms of resources for?
Just knowledge for academics to become more familiar with the terminologies and the best practices.
So a lot of that is available via the, such as the IVHHN's website, through the USGS, VDAP, a lot of our own website, the Seismic Research Center. A lot of it is being shared on the social media platforms, but I caution people to follow the official, websites and resources, because a lot of misinformation is shared and people then take the information and share it in their own way, which is not always an accurate representation of the original material. So this is just a little precautionary, wanting to look for the correct advice from the official sources.
So I think they were more talking about academics, so not the social media side of it.
So academics, there's a lot available on ResearchGate, searching through libraries, online, online articles and so on. Remember, the science is new, so we haven't even collected a lot of the ash samples. This would be brand new, and analysis takes some time. So so people who are interested in collaborating and so on, we've had a lot of that. A lot of people reaching out to us, but remember, it's still a red zone, and even us as scientists on the ground have limited ability to get in there right now while things are dangerous to collect any kind of sample.
Understood. Professor Horwell, I have a question for you regarding the impact on children. Those who are under 2 can't wear masks. The particulate matter and SO2 exposure. What are the risks and mitigation measures that you should take in those instances?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is a tricky one to answer. You're right that it's very hard to, babies and toddlers to wear masks is impossible. So the best advice is to try and keep them out of the ash as much as possible. Keep them indoors if you can. Make sure your indoor environment is safe. It doesn't get too hot. And what I mean by that is, when we say close the doors and windows, we mean that when the conditions outside are bad, when there's ash falling, if you can smell the gas. But as soon as the conditions clear, then open up your house again, reventilate it, cool it down as best as you can. And that's the best thing to do for your young kids, is just to reduce their exposure as much as you can.
Thank you. This one may be out of everybody's realm, or it may not be. The TT Met Office announced a dry spell upcoming. Is this because of the volcanic ash fall, and would it affect the upcoming hurricane season? Is there a sort of impact on the weather of this event?
Well, I don't think that the dry spell would be directly associated with the volcanic activity. I mean, as you know, global warming and the effects of, in particular in tropical regions, have been noted for the last few years in terms of a dry season and a wet season, and all of the more intense hurricane seasons and so on. So I think that's more of a global trends or what's happening on a global scale rather than directly related to the volcano. Other than that, there isn't much I could add to that question.
Okay. Just remember, we have viewers and watchers from all over, so we have to make sure that we answer the questions that are out there in the community. So if it is beyond your scope, or you don't think it is based in fact, then I may still ask it, just so that we have clarity. We have one question here regarding the uses of ash. It's believed to be a good nutrient for the soil, and as a result, farmers will have bountiful crops in the future. Is there any truth to this, and what sort of time frame would we be looking at?
I'm happy to answer this one. I did my PhD on this on this topic. So in short, yes, volcanic ash can be a really rich source of nutrients for plants. The question is how much, which is always the problem. How much of a good thing? So when you've got maybe less than an inch of ash being falling, less than sort of 2.5 or 2 to 3 centimeters, that's usually quite good for most volcanic soils, especially if it can be integrated into the soil. It's a rich source of calcium, potassium, so on. The challenge is if there's a large volume of ash that's fallen, maybe more than half a foot, for example, that can be quite damaging for soils and plants in the short term. But in the long term, and by that I mean maybe 5 to 10 years, usually recovery is especially in tropical environments, is usually quite rapid. An important point to note, and I think something that perhaps needs to be stressed further, that Dr. Joseph said before, is when we do have lots of ash blanketing a landscape, when there is rainfall and it can be remobilized or moved or eroded by that rainfall, and can lead to lahars, or the way to think of them is like volcano debris flows, or like a flash flood in a way. That can be really challenging for farmers and for communities which are in areas which may be affected by those flows. So anything that can be done to help stimulate vegetation to stabilize the ash is a good thing. And so if there are opportunities to mix ash into soils, or even to rehabilitate some surfaces, that's will be helpful for not just your farm or your area, but also the people that are potentially exposed downstream from that issue.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Dr. Ramroop, this may be in your bailiwick. Was a systemic vulnerability study conducted prior to the eruption to identify which lifeline systems would have been most impacted? If yes, how did this information help with planning and coordination during the emergency impact phases?
Yes, well, as I indicated that I was part of the SEDIMA team as one of the coordinators when I started in ODPM in 2011 and I left in 2017. Even at that time, St. Vincent had, through NEMO, which is the Emergency Management Agency, they were pretty good in terms of their planning. A lot of the plans were developed. There were models created by SEDIMA for most of the countries, and the answer to that is yes. But the extent to which those plans, I'm not involved in St. Vincent. I am not in NEMO. I'm a Rotarian who is trying to coordinate with my other Rotarians as a representative sitting with NEMO now for this impact. So I'm not too accurate with what exactly is the details of those systemic planning, but it's pretty good because the guy who is working there with us in terms of coordinating is actually a member of a number of the planning committees, and from what he was saying is that they have been pretty okay. I think the biggest problem with those plans and a lot of the systemic assessment of the country has been a resource issue in terms of funds and in terms of funding those plans and structural and non-structural mitigation programs. Funding is a problem. There's obviously, if you look at the research, and most of the research journals and peer-reviewed articles will tell you, mitigation programs don't get enough funding, all right, compared to relief and humanitarian efforts. And that's a global phenomena that we have, where less money politically is spent on mitigation programs. So although NEMO might have had good mitigation programs and systemic assessments and plans, and it might have been pretty okay, the problem is to roll out those plans and to put the necessary funding and resources to implement those plans. That may have been a problem, right? I'm speaking as having been in the system for over 7 years. That is my experience. And I mean, I worked with SRC during those 7 years as well. And I can well imagine that some of the same problems that Dr. Joseph is talking about, they had it during that period as well. So it seems to be a common thread. And again, when you look at some of the peer-reviewed articles in terms of mitigation programs, the same thing all over, right? Politicians tend to spend less on mitigation programs because they don't see the real benefits in the short term. So the answer to that, it needs persistence. It's something that things like, you know, some of the engagements like this helps, but it needs to be persistent. And I think that SEDIMA themselves don't have enough even resources themselves. And because of the fact that the Caribbean is a number of different sovereignties, that has been a bigger problem, because when we develop models for some of these community toolkits, etc., the models were not implemented within specific sovereignties because of, you know, individual problems within, or individual issues within each municipalities or each sovereignty. So it's a complex issue in terms of translating systemic assessments in terms of planning and development in this current fourth industrial age now, and of course the dwindling of the resources, and now further with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that is also going to put a damper onto how we're looking at some of these simple structural and non-structural mitigation programs. Of course, if we can identify some of the programs that are mutually beneficial, and I think that is something like building codes, for example, where if we could have a national building code that will take care of an earthquake or a hurricane or a volcano, and there are similar types of activities that we could put in, I think that would be the best sell. So I think that is probably the way we have to go forward with that. I hope I answered your question, but as I said, I'm not in St. Vincent, I'm not part of that. I can tell you about Trinidad and Tobago, but I can't tell you about St. Vincent.
Well, you indicated. Go ahead, Dr. Joseph.
Sorry, Mr. Nicholson. Just to add to what Dr. Ramroop said, one of the challenges we actually had was that the eruption began in an effusive manner, and it was very hard to appeal to stakeholders that this actually was an emergency, and that we needed to prepare for the possible transition from effusive to explosive. And this is why, as Dr. Ramroop indicated, there was this rush when it became explosive now to respond rather than the input into the mitigation for the planning for it actually doing so.
It's always hard to convince people unless it's directly impacting them. Professor Horwell, I have one here for you. It's quite a long question, so I'm going to sort of paraphrase it. But you know, given that we're going to have remobilization of ash sort of blowing off the trees and streets and so on, and the advice is to keep your windows and doors shut in a hot climate. If you don't have air conditioning, it could be pretty intense. So is it okay then to open your window a couple hours a day? When would you advise them to do that? Is it like when there's little traffic? You know, what would the average person have to do to try and keep themselves safe, but also sane by not sweating to death?
Yeah, it's really challenging to have to stay indoors and to try and stop the ash getting into your homes in a tropical climate. It's not easy. The most important thing is your own safety. So you should not be in an environment where it's getting too hot or where you feel like you're not getting, you know, not refreshing the air in a regular interval. So you know, you need to look after yourself primarily. As I mentioned earlier, breathing in a bit of ash, especially if you're a healthy person, is not going to do you significant harm. Much more harm is going to come from heat exhaustion, for example. So opening up your windows and doors in periods where the air quality improves, you know, whenever you can see that the conditions are better than they were. For example, you know, trying to close up when there's actually ash falling, or when you can sense that there's a kind of cloud of ash in the air. That's the right time to close up. And then when the air is cleared a bit, especially after rainfall, if you get rainfall, that's excellent because it really helps to wash the particles and gases out of the air. Yeah, it's not easy at all, but the main risk is you know, is probably not the ash if you're a relatively healthy person. So, you know, look after yourself in other ways is my advice.
Dr. Ramroop, we have a question here for you. How can local engineers from Trinidad and Tobago get involved to help St. Vincent? Is there a need for conducting damage assessments and planning repair work for critical infrastructure?
Yes, there will be a need, definitely. I think that NEMO, as well as the Prime Minister, has indicated that when that time comes, they will request through a bilateral agreement for as well as through SEDEMA, where skills will be required to go across, you know, and assist in their rehabilitation and reconstruction. As I indicated, there are going to be a number of structural and non-structural things that are going to be has to be done, especially the sociological part of it, where we have to look at these displaced persons and where we're going to put them if they're going to go back into their homes. And I think a lot of that will have to be infrastructure geared, so and environmental geared as well, public health as well. So they're going to be they're going to look at some of. They don't have all the, of course, they don't have all the skills and competencies there. They have, but I think through NEMO and through the National Disaster Office here and through the bilateral agreements with Trinidad, I think that they will request. It's happened before in other countries for hydrometeorological issues, so it will happen again. And they will ask for a list of the competencies that are required and the persons who are capable and have the time to go across and assist with them. So yes, that will come for sure. It will come.
Thank you. I have a question here which Professors Wilson and Horwell may be able to respond to. When can animals be let out and left in the yard and fields? We've been advised to keep our pets and livestock indoors during the ash fall. At what stage would you recommend that they can be let out to roam freely again, or be tied out to pasture?
It's a really good question, and one which is quite an uncertain one to answer. So I'm feeling awkward. You can see the other panel members also looking awkward. So I think the best advice would be if your animals have access to clean water and feed, then there should be no problems, or there should be a lower risk of them having any issues if they're out roaming around in an ashy environment. Depending on the type of animal, And I'm particularly thinking of animals which often have their nose or their mouth very close to the ground for feeding or for sniffing around or fossicking. Then they can ingest quite a lot of ash into their respiratory tract or into their gut. So you just need to be careful with what they're doing, but it really depends a lot on the animal. But I think the simplest advice is if there's access to clean water and clean feed, then that often will mitigate most of the things that you can control at least.
We have 5 minutes of Q&A left, so we do have to wrap up. I have one question here that's just come in, and I think it will allow everybody to have a final say. What lessons can we take from places like Iceland, and how applicable are their recent volcanic events to us in the Caribbean? Not all at once.
So yeah, so I think we should bear in mind that the type of volcanic activity seen in places like Iceland and Hawaii is very different from what we see here in the Caribbean, because the type of magma is very different. In Iceland and Hawaii, it's more runny, has a lot less silica. Whereas in the Caribbean region, our magma has a lot more silica, therefore it's very thick and viscous, so it doesn't flow very far from the dome or the vent. So we tend to have dome building types of eruptions and with it explosions versus lava flows. With our type of eruptions, it tends to be very explosive and can generate the types of hazards that I mentioned before, the heavy ash falls and the pyroclastic density currents. So this is, something to keep in mind. So I will let Professor Horwell and Wilkinson add.
Yeah, I don't think I've got a lot more to add. Actually, I completely agree with Dr. Joseph that the eruptions in Iceland and Hawaii, for example, are very different. There are certainly lessons to be learned from other similar volcanoes, and of course, Soufriere Hills on Montserrat has been a great kind of learning experience for all the volcanologists and all the other disciplines who come into work there. And we, the field of understanding about the health hazards of volcanic eruptions leapt forward hugely through the experience of Soufriere Hills eruption, and much of what, in fact, the birth of the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network really happened because of my experiences of working on Montserrat and realizing how much I needed to bring in all these different disciplines to answer the questions around volcanoes and health. So we can learn a lot from other eruptions, and we will learn a lot from this eruption for future eruptions too.
Right, so we do have, unless Professor Wilson wanted to say something.
No, I totally agree. I think one of the things that you're seeing with this particular crisis is a lot of evidence and learnings from previous eruption crises, and so it's really, at least from my perspective as an outsider, it's really pleasing to see that knowledge being shared. And the key thing is, I guess, to support those that are managing this crisis as best we can.
Yeah, I just want to say that from the beginning, that from the time that we learned from the SRC that things were happening in St. Vincent, and the Rotary team was set up, and they started sharing their messages on WhatsApp, and we began planning. A lot of the resources, a lot of the information that was coming from their plan in St. Vincent through NEMO, it was informed by authoritative peer-reviewed articles and plans from prior evidence that we had from previous volcanoes. I think that what will happen when we look at this one is a lot of other countries might learn from us, because we had a situation where evacuation would have been the main thing in the beginning, and then we realized that we couldn't evacuate to the shelters that were designated because COVID was a big problem in terms of the numbers of persons in those shelters. So the infrastructural arrangements that we had to make for COVID was a bit different to moving people into shelters previously. So that's a whole, that COVID-19 has put a whole different things in terms of moving people across the Caribbean, moving even soldiers to come, getting tested before they come. I mean, all of these simple things are big things, and I think that is something that we have learned over the past few days in the chat. All right, in terms of the Rotary chat, where we're on the ground actually, and we're talking about things on the ground. So although we might look at all the best practices, when you look at some of the charts, it's simple things that needed to be done before, and we learned lessons, but unfortunately, we just were not able to put those things in place because of some other things, so we don't want to get into that there now. But I think that we have learned lessons, and indeed that's how we are. Nobody has been reported dead, and there has been no injuries, which is a good indicator, right? And that's what we want when we worked with the United Nations suite of indicators for the global disaster risk reduction, the Sendai suite of indicators. That's a very key indicator that we have lost no lives. And I think that we're going to lose a lot of property. But as I said, if we look at what's going to happen with the ash and how we rehabilitate ourselves working with the ash rather than trying to get rid of the ash, I think that's a whole philosophy going forward, and then with the system of the rains coming, with the blockage of some of the natural routes for water, there's going to be flooding, etc., as well as these mudslides. So it's going to be a different approach over the next hurricane season. And I think that if all the key stakeholders, this is not finished now. Some of the major risks are going to happen. And I think once we understand that, then we will know that it's not going to end with the volcano stopping. And I think that is what we have to learn from Iceland and some of the other countries, that it didn't stop. It didn't stop when the eruption stopped, right? There was a whole period of reconstruction, rehabilitation, education, etc. Managing social media, managing mental stress. So there's a whole set of things that will have to come into being, especially looking at your silicosis 10, 20 years later in the children. So, I mean, all of these things will have to happen.
Thank you very much. Obviously, there were some questions we didn't get to ask. There were a lot of questions in the chat, very engaged audience. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to present today. I'm going to pass over to our President-elect, Devanath Maharaj, for him to do the vote of thanks.
Thank you, George. Well, on behalf of ASHRAE Caricom, we were pleased to bring you this current affairs discussion. While the island of St. Vincent continues to be affected, and the people of Barbados are actively involved in repeat mopping up and sweeping up operations, many continue to still be indirectly affected, and in accordance with what Dr. Joseph has repeated, will continue to so do for a long time. On behalf of ASHRAE Caricom, I would like to thank our contributors for making this event a success. There are additional resources to be had at our ashrae.org website, www.ashrae.org/IAQ, indoor air quality. And also there'll be a follow-up email on the resources presented this evening. I'd like to thank our distinguished panel of presenters, very knowledgeable, Dr. Joseph, Professor Wilson, Professor Horwell, and Dr. Ramroop. Also our partners, Dr. Manohar and the UWI Faculty of Engineering, St.Augustine Campus, Janet Carew and team UWI TV, TAJ 92.3 FM in Trinidad. Our ASHRAE Region 12 Director and Regional Chair, DRC Robin Bryant. My fellow panelist, Kiran Nanan. He's famously known as the driving force behind ASHRAE Caricom. He's the youngest member of the executive, and he mobilizes us all just to support him. So congratulations again, Kiran, and thank you very much for pulling this together. Also our president, George Nicholson, president of ASHRAE Caricom, Dr. Leah Garner O'Neill, Johan Rampersad behind the scenes, Akil Clark, and last and certainly not least, our listening audience. We started off this evening with 90, well, at one point we got up to 96 participants, listening audience, and we are down to 68. So thank you very much for sticking it out with us. I hope it was an enjoyable educational experience. And thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much for your presentations and for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, team. We will chat outside of here. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.